Rain had been falling over Seattle since late afternoon, the kind of steady drizzle that turned streets into mirrors and made the world feel quieter than usual. Inside a modest two-story house on Alder Street, Clark Bennett sat alone on his couch, laptop resting untouched beside him. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the tapping rain against the windows were the only sounds keeping him company. He had moved into the house 3 months earlier, hoping a new city would help him reset his life. Seattle felt different from everywhere he had lived before. Calm but heavy, beautiful yet distant. The gray skies matched the mood he carried most days. Freelance graphic design allowed him to work from home, which meant entire days could pass without real conversation. Tonight was one of those nights. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the table, long gone cold. The television played a random documentary he wasn't watching. Clark leaned back, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how silence could sometimes feel peaceful and other times painfully loud. He checked his phone. No messages, no notifications, just the time slowly moving forward. He sighed and stood up, walking toward the kitchen. Outside, headlights reflected across wet pavement as cars passed by. People were going somewhere, meeting friends, sharing dinners, living lives that felt full. Clark told himself he preferred solitude, but evenings like this made that belief harder to maintain. The doorbell rang. The sudden sound startled him. Clark frowned slightly. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a brief second, he considered ignoring it, assuming it was a delivery mistake or someone at the wrong house. But the bell rang again, short, casual, almost playful. He opened the door. Standing there was Jimmy Carter, his neighbor from next door, holding a plastic bag filled with snacks and a confident smile that somehow cut through the gloomy evening. Jimmy looked effortlessly relaxed, hoodie slightly damp from the rain, hair messy in a way that seemed intentional, energy radiating warmth even in cold weather. "Hey," Jimmy said casually. "You look like you were having the most exciting night ever earlier," meaning absolutely nothing was happening. Clark blinked, surprised. "You were watching me?" Jimmy laughed. "Your living room window faces my driveway." Hard not to notice a guy staring at his TV like it personally offended him. Clark couldn't help smiling a little. Jimmy lifted the bag. "Movie night rescue mission. I brought snacks. You can say no, but honestly you shouldn't." For a moment, Clark hesitated. He wasn't used to spontaneous company. Most of his friendships existed through texts or occasional planned meetings. But something about Jimmy's easy confidence made refusing feel unnecessary. He stepped aside. "Come in." Jimmy walked in like he already belonged there, shaking rain from his jacket and looking around with curiosity. "Nice place. Minimalist. Either very stylish, or you just moved in and never unpacked." "A little of both," Clark admitted. Jimmy dropped onto the couch comfortably, placing snacks on the table. Within minutes, the quiet house felt different. Alive, lighter, warmer. Clark noticed how naturally Jimmy filled silence. He talked about work at a local gym, funny customers, bad coffee shops he had tried, and random stories that somehow made ordinary life sound entertaining. Clark found himself laughing more than he had in weeks. They scrolled through streaming options together, arguing jokingly about what counted as a good movie. Jimmy insisted on something emotional. Clark voted for action. Eventually, they settled on a romantic drama neither had seen. The lights dimmed. Rain intensified outside, creating a soft background rhythm. At first, they watched normally, commenting on scenes, joking about predictable dialogue. But slowly the mood of the film shifted. Characters on screen spoke about love, regret, missed chances. Conversations became quieter. Clark became aware of small details. Jimmy leaning slightly closer to read subtitles, their shoulders brushing accidentally. The comfortable silence that replaced earlier chatter. It didn't feel awkward. It felt easy. Clark realized he hadn't felt this relaxed around someone new in a long time. Usually he measured every word, careful not to reveal too much. But with Jimmy, conversation flowed naturally, without effort. Halfway through the movie, Jimmy stretched and groaned dramatically. "This couch is terrible for serious cinema appreciation." Clark raised an eyebrow. "Serious cinema appreciation?" "Absolutely. Jimmy said. "We need a better viewing setup." He pointed toward the large floor mattress near the TV, the one Clark rarely used except when working late nights. Without overthinking it, they moved there, bringing blankets and snacks along. The shift felt casual, practical, yet somehow more personal. They lay side by side, watching the screen. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the city. The room felt smaller now, more private. The glow from the television painted soft light across Jimmy's face. Clark noticed how relaxed he looked, how genuine his expressions were when he laughed or reacted to scenes. Another emotional moment played in the movie. Jimmy spoke quietly without looking away from the screen. Funny how movies always make people braver than real life. Clark considered that. Maybe real life just takes longer. Jimmy nodded slightly. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It carried understanding. Clark felt something unfamiliar settling inside him. Not excitement exactly, not nervousness either. Just a quiet awareness that tonight felt different from his usual routine. The rain continued falling, sealing the house away from the rest of the world. For the first time since moving to Seattle, Clark didn't feel alone in it. They settled onto the floor mattress, blankets loosely spread around them, the television casting soft, shifting light across the room. From this angle, the movie felt closer, more immersive, almost as if the outside world had faded away completely. Jimmy adjusted a pillow behind his head and stretched his legs. "Okay," he said with satisfaction. "This is how movies are supposed to be watched." Clark laughed quietly and leaned back beside him. The distance between them was smaller now, but it didn't feel strange. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm, turning the house into a private shelter from the rest of Seattle. For a few minutes, they watched in comfortable silence. The movie's characters were arguing about love, about missed opportunities, and things left unsaid. Emotional music filled the room. Clark noticed himself paying less attention to the plot and more to the atmosphere around him. Jimmy's shoulder brushed against his again. This time, neither of them shifted away. Jimmy grabbed a handful of popcorn and offered it without looking. Clark reached at the same moment, their hands touching briefly. A small pause followed, just long enough to notice. Jimmy smiled faintly. "You ever think movies make everything look easier than it actually is?" Clark kept his eyes on the screen. "Easier how?" "Feelings," Jimmy said. "People always know exactly what they want. Real life isn't like that." Clark nodded slowly. "Real life's messy." "Yeah," Jimmy replied softly. "And people pretend they're not confused." The conversation drifted into deeper territory without warning. They talked about past relationships, disappointments, and the strange pressure to have life figured out by a certain age. Clark admitted he often avoided emotional risks. Starting over in a new city had felt safer than facing unresolved parts of himself. Jimmy listened carefully, unusually quiet now. "You don't seem like someone who runs away," Jimmy said. Clark gave a small smile. "Everyone runs from something." A romantic scene appeared on the television. Two characters confessing feelings after pretending to be just friends for years. The dialogue felt almost too close to home. Jimmy exhaled slowly. Timing changes everything. Clark turned slightly toward him. "What do you mean?" Jimmy hesitated before answering. "Sometimes you meet people when you're finally ready to understand yourself." The words lingered between them. Neither laughed it off. Outside, thunder rolled faintly again, and the lights flickered for a moment before stabilizing. The brief darkness seemed to shrink the distance between them even more. Jimmy shifted onto his side, facing Clark now. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Are you happy here?" "Like really happy?" The question caught Clark off guard. He thought carefully before answering. "I'm peaceful, but I don't know if that's the same thing." Jimmy nodded as if he understood perfectly. Their conversation slowed, becoming softer, more personal. The movie continued playing, but it had turned into background noise, an excuse to share space rather than the center of attention. At one point, Jimmy laughed at a dramatic line from the film and instinctively leaned closer, his arm briefly resting against Clark's. He didn't pull away immediately. Instead, he stayed there, relaxed, as if closeness required no explanation. Clark felt an unfamiliar calm settle over him. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet connection forming naturally. The glow from the television reflected in Jimmy's eyes as he spoke again, almost thoughtfully. You know what I like about nights like this? What? They're honest. No plans, no pretending. Just being. Clark realized he agreed completely. He hadn't noticed how late it had become. The rain, the dim lighting, and the steady rhythm of shared conversation made time feel slower. Every small moment seemed amplified. The sound of breathing, the warmth of blankets, the occasional shared glance followed by shy smiles. Another emotional scene played on screen, the characters holding hands during a difficult confession. Jimmy glanced at Clark, then back at the TV. Funny how people wait so long to say what they feel. Clark swallowed lightly. Maybe they're afraid, saying it changes everything. Jimmy's voice lowered. Sometimes change isn't the scary part. Not knowing is. Silence followed again, but this silence felt charged. Not uncomfortable, just meaningful. The kind that made both of them aware that something subtle was shifting between friendship and something harder to define. Jimmy reached for the remote, lowering the volume slightly. The room grew quieter. Neither moved away. Clark noticed how natural the closeness felt now, as if the evening had gently rewritten the boundaries between strangers and friends. Conversation no longer required effort. Presence itself felt enough. Outside, the storm softened into a gentle drizzle. Inside, the house felt warmer than it had all night. Clark realized he wasn't thinking about loneliness anymore. He wasn't thinking about the past or future either. He was simply present, sharing a quiet moment that felt unexpectedly important. Jimmy stretched again and laughed under his breath. Best random decision I made today. Clark smiled. Coming over? Jimmy looked at him briefly, sincere. Yeah. The movie continued playing, but neither of them seemed in a hurry for it to end. The storm deepened as the night moved forward. Rain tapped steadily against the windows, and distant thunder rolled across the Seattle skyline like a slow heartbeat. Inside the house, the lights suddenly flickered once, twice, and then faded completely. The television went dark. For a moment, neither Clark nor Jimmy spoke. Only the sound of rain remained. Jimmy let out a quiet laugh. Well, I guess the movie decided we needed a break. Clark stood and moved carefully through the dim room, finding a candle near the kitchen counter. He lit it, and a warm golden glow replaced the cold blue light that had filled the space earlier. Shadows danced across the walls, softening everything. The furniture, the room, even their expressions. When Clark returned, Jimmy was sitting upright, watching the flame flicker. Feels different now, Jimmy said. Clark nodded as he placed the candle on the table beside them. The darkness outside made the house feel isolated, almost removed from time itself. Without phones buzzing or screens glowing, the night became quieter, more honest. They sat facing each other now, rather than watching a screen. Conversation came naturally again, but slower this time, as if each word carried more weight. Jimmy leaned back slightly. You ever notice how people open up more when there's nothing distracting them? Clark smiled faintly. Maybe silence makes it harder to hide. Jimmy studied him thoughtfully. You hide a lot, don't you? The question wasn't accusing, just curious. Clark hesitated before answering. I guess I learned it's easier to keep things simple. Less complicated that way. And does that actually work? Clark looked toward the candlelight, considering. It keeps things safe. Jimmy nodded, understanding. Safe doesn't always mean happy. The words lingered. Clark felt something shift inside him. He had spent years defining himself through routines and distance, convincing himself independence was enough. But tonight, sitting here in quiet conversation, he realized how rare it was to feel truly understood without explanation. Jimmy's presence carried a strange comfort, steady, warm, unforced. Outside, thunder echoed again, closer this time. Jimmy moved slightly closer, resting his arms on his knees. His voice softened. You know, when I first moved next door, I thought you were the kind of guy who preferred being alone. Clark chuckled lightly. I thought the same about myself. Jimmy smiled. And now? Clark looked at him honestly. Now I'm not so sure. The candlelight reflected in Jimmy's eyes, making the moment feel suspended between past and future. There was no rush, no pressure, just awareness growing quietly between them. Jimmy spoke again, more thoughtful than before. Sometimes life surprises you with people you weren't looking for. Clark felt his chest tighten slightly, not from discomfort but from recognition. The night had unfolded without planning, yet it felt meaningful in a way he couldn't fully explain. They talked about childhood memories, dreams they had abandoned, and the versions of themselves they once imagined becoming. Jimmy admitted he often hid behind humor because seriousness made him vulnerable. Clark confessed he feared being misunderstood more than being alone. Each admission brought them closer, not physically but emotionally. At some point, conversation slowed into comfortable quiet. They sat side by side again, watching the candle flicker. Clark became aware of small details: the warmth of shared space, the calm rhythm of breathing, the absence of loneliness that usually followed midnight hours. It felt unfamiliar, yet deeply natural. Jimmy broke the silence gently. "Tonight feels important." Clark glanced at him. "Why?" Jimmy shrugged slightly. "Because it feels real. No expectations. No pretending." Clark realized he felt the same way. For the first time since arriving in Seattle, he wasn't analyzing every emotion or questioning every reaction. He simply allowed himself to experience the moment as it was, uncertain, honest, and quietly transformative. The storm outside began to ease, rain softening into a lighter rhythm. Jimmy leaned back onto the mattress, staring at the ceiling. You ever think there's a moment when life changes and you don't even realize it until later? Clark lay back beside him, eyes following the moving shadows overhead. "Maybe we're in one of those moments right now." Neither laughed. The words didn't feel dramatic, just true. Clark sensed an invisible line within himself slowly fading, the boundary between who he thought he was and who he might become. The realization wasn't loud or overwhelming. It arrived gently, like dawn approaching after a long night. He wasn't afraid of uncertainty anymore. Instead, he felt curious. Beside him, Jimmy exhaled quietly, relaxed and calm. The closeness between them carried no urgency, only trust growing naturally through shared honesty. Time passed unnoticed. The candle burned lower, and somewhere between conversation and silence, Clark understood that this night was less about answers and more about awakening, about allowing himself to feel without needing to define everything immediately. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel intimidating. It felt open. The candle had burned halfway down when the quiet was suddenly interrupted by a sharp metallic sound from the front door. A key turning in the lock. Clark sat up immediately. Jimmy frowned. "Are you expecting someone?" Clark shook his head. "No." The door slowly opened, letting in a rush of cool night air and the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, calm, unhurried, confident. A tall man stepped inside. He paused near the entrance, as if giving his eyes time to adjust to the dim lighting. His coat was damp from the rain, and he carried himself with the relaxed authority of someone completely comfortable walking into another person's space. Clark recognized him instantly. Adrian Smith, the property owner. Smith was in his early 40s, sharply dressed even at this hour, known in the neighborhood as a businessman who owned several houses on the block. He rarely visited without notice. Clark stood quickly. "Mr. Smith, I didn't know you were coming tonight." Smith closed the door behind him and offered a calm, polite smile. His gaze moved around the room, taking in the candlelight, the blankets, the late-night atmosphere. "I apologize for the surprise," he said smoothly. "There was a report about a possible water leak from the unit next door. I had to check before it became a problem." His voice carried no urgency, yet his presence immediately changed the mood of the room. Jimmy sat upright but remained calm, watching carefully. Smith's eyes briefly rested on both of them together. Not judgmental, not shocked, just observant, as if he were silently understanding more than anyone had said aloud. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Well," Smith said lightly, I see the storm turned into a long evening. Clark felt an unexpected tension rise in his chest. The night that had felt private and protected now seemed exposed under someone else's awareness. Jimmy spoke politely. "We were just watching a movie." "I can see that," Smith replied, his tone neutral but thoughtful. He walked slowly farther into the living room, examining the ceiling and walls as though checking for damage. Yet his attention seemed divided. There was something calculating in the way he observed the room, like a man piecing together a story without asking questions. The candlelight cast shadows across his face, making his expression harder to read. After a moment, he nodded. "No leak here." "That's good." Silence followed. Instead of leaving immediately, Smith remained standing, hands in his coat pockets. The atmosphere shifted again, not uncomfortable but heavier. Clark sensed that Smith wasn't simply concerned about plumbing. Smith looked at Clark thoughtfully. "You're settling into Seattle well?" Clark hesitated. "I think so." Smith's gaze moved briefly toward Jimmy before returning. "Interesting city. It has a way of revealing people to themselves." The statement felt deliberate. Jimmy exchanged a quick glance with Clark. Smith smiled faintly, almost amused by their confusion. "Relax. I'm not here to interrupt your evening." He walked toward the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street. "I've learned something after years of dealing with tenants and businesses," he continued. "Everyone carries private moments that shape who they become. Most people pretend those moments don't matter." Clark wasn't sure how to respond. Smith turned back toward them. "But sometimes," he added, "those moments are exactly where real decisions begin." The room fell quiet again. Clark felt exposed, not because of anything specific Smith had seen, but because the man spoke as if he understood more than surface appearances. Jimmy crossed his arms slightly, protective but composed. "Is everything okay with the house?" "Oh, the house is fine," Smith said calmly. "My concern is opportunity." Clark blinked. "Opportunity?" Smith nodded. "I'm starting a new development project downtown. Creative spaces, shared studios, collaborative work environments. I've been looking for residents with perspective." He paused, studying Clark carefully. "You work from home, don't you?" "Design." Clark nodded slowly, surprised. "I pay attention to the people who live in my properties," Smith explained. "Talent often hides behind quiet routines." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "So this is a business visit now?" Smith chuckled softly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps timing simply aligned." He stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Life occasionally offers doors that open without warning. The question is whether someone has the courage to walk through them." Clark felt the weight of the moment. The evening had begun as simple companionship, yet now it carried unexpected significance. Smith reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the table beside the candle. "Think about it," he said. "I believe people reveal their true potential when they stop pretending to be who they were yesterday." He glanced once more at both of them. Not intrusive, not disapproving, just knowingly observant. Then he smiled politely. "I'll let you continue your night." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The lock clicked softly behind him as he left, and the sound of rain filled the silence again. For several seconds, neither Clark nor Jimmy spoke. The room felt different now. The warmth of earlier moments remained, but it was layered with something new: awareness, possibility, and a faint sense that the night had shifted beyond personal connection into something larger. Jimmy finally exhaled. "Well, that was unexpected." Clark nodded slowly, staring at the business card glowing beside the candle flame. The interruption hadn't broken the night. It had changed its meaning.
The sound of the closing door lingered long after Adrian Smith had left. Rain continued falling outside, softer now, almost peaceful, as if the storm itself had reached a quiet conclusion. Clark remained seated, staring at the business card resting beside the candle. The small piece of paper felt heavier than it should have, carrying more meaning than a simple invitation. Jimmy leaned back on his hands and let out a slow breath. "Your landlord definitely knows how to make an entrance." Clark smiled faintly, but didn't respond immediately. His thoughts moved through everything that had happened that night. The unexpected visit, the long conversations, the strange feeling that something inside him had shifted. Nothing dramatic had occurred, yet everything felt different. Jimmy glanced at him. "You okay?" Clark nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking. About the project?" Clark picked up the card, turning it between his fingers. "Not just that." He struggled to explain the feeling. It wasn't only about work or opportunity. It was about the realization that he had spent years avoiding change, convincing himself that stability meant staying still. Tonight had challenged that belief. Jimmy watched him quietly. The easy humor from earlier had softened into something more sincere. "You know," Jimmy said, "sometimes life pushes you exactly where you need to go, even if it feels random at first." Clark looked at him. "You really believe that?" Jimmy shrugged with a small smile. "I think people cross paths for reasons we don't understand right away." The candle flickered, its flame growing smaller. Clark realized he no longer felt the heaviness that usually followed midnight. The loneliness that had filled the house earlier was gone, replaced by calm clarity. He stood and walked toward the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of water. When he returned, he handed one to Jimmy. "To unexpected nights," Jimmy said lightly, raising the glass. Clark laughed. "To unexpected nights." They sat together in comfortable silence, no longer needing conversation to fill the space. The quiet now felt peaceful rather than empty. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. Clark thought about the version of himself who had sat alone hours earlier, convinced nothing meaningful would happen that evening. He barely recognized that person now. The night had shown him something simple but powerful. That change didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it entered quietly, through conversation, honesty, and the courage to remain open. Jimmy stretched and glanced toward the window. "Looks like the storm's finally ending." Clark followed his gaze. Streetlights reflected on wet roads, and the clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing faint hints of morning light approaching. He felt an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Not anxiety, not uncertainty, just possibility. Jimmy stood, grabbing his jacket from the chair. "I should probably head back before sunrise. Makes this look like I never went home." Clark walked him to the door. For a brief moment, they stood there, neither in a hurry to end the evening. Jimmy smiled gently. "I'm glad I knocked tonight." Clark nodded. "Me too." There was understanding in the silence that followed. No need for promises or explanations. Whatever this connection was, it didn't require labels or rushed decisions. It simply existed, honest and real. Jimmy stepped outside into the cool air, then turned back. "Hey, whatever you decide about that opportunity, I think you're ready for something new." Clark watched him walk toward the neighboring house, disappearing into the fading rain. He closed the door slowly. The house felt different now. Not quieter, but fuller, as if it carried the memory of shared laughter and meaningful conversation. Clark returned to the living room, extinguished the candle, and stood by the window watching the first light of dawn spread across Seattle. He looked again at the business card in his hand. For the first time since moving to the city, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt open. Clark understood that the night hadn't changed him instantly. Instead, it had given him permission to change himself. A new day was beginning, and this time, he was ready to step forward rather than stay still. Like and subscribe the channel comment for Part 2.